What is up, everyone? My name is Zach. I'm an art director and designer, and in this video I'm going to show you how to recreate realistic vintage type using my vintage plastisol brush set and other effects within Adobe Photoshop. Let's get into it. This is the original design that I created for my vintage plastisol brush set, and I'm going to be recreating this from scratch so that you guys can see exactly how I put it together. Hopefully these text effects will help you out. This document is a 3000 by 3000 pixel 300 dpi document. It doesn't have to be exactly that size when you create it, but you want to do something in high res, so I would suggest using 300 dpi. It just makes the effects work a little bit better. So having said that, we will zoom out. The top layer here is just the shirt texture. So I'm going to turn that off for now. And I'm going to turn off the original design. So the first thing that we want to do here is grab your text tool and start laying out some type. So we're going to do plastisol and I'm going to use the same typeface that I used on the original, which was compacta bold, and then we're going to scale this up. And we're going to adjust. We'll make this -20, tighten it up a little bit, adjust any kerning that you would like to. So the idea behind this design has a lot of ink bleed and sort of a vintage screen printed aesthetic. So we want the type to be relatively close together so that we can produce some ink bleed between the letters. So that looks pretty good. Perfect. And we're going to go into the layer styles here. We're going to add a stroke of about 40 pixels. And then we're going to make this a convert to smart object. Okay. And then we're going to go into that smart object. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a little bit of texture, because the plan is to add a Gaussian blur, a threshold, and some crystallize to it. But before that we do that, we want to add some texture in here so that the threshold will react differently to it, and we'll get some cracks and things like that. So let's throw in some texture here. So I have this folder full of a lot of different black and white grunge. Anything will work as long as it's threshold. So you have only black and white values. You don't want gray values to do this sort of effect. So I'm just going to select one here. Kind of want more chunky like that. So we're going to drag it in. We're going to blow it up. And then we're going to roughly kind of select where we think we might want. We can modify this later, but for the time being. And then what we're going to do is we're going to invert it. We're going to grab our magic wand. Actually, before we do that, we have to rasterize this texture layer. Grab our magic wand, delete the background so that we only have the black on top. So this texture will not be exactly like the original, but it will give the idea of exactly how I did it, because to be honest, I'm not even sure which texture I used originally. But so we will just go with it. So after we get the texture in, we're gonna leave it like that and see how the effects handle it. We can always modify it and throw in a different texture if we don't like how things are looking. So we're going to Command S, save that smart object. And then what we're going to do here on this smart object is we're going to go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. The blur we want to add about, it can vary. We'll go with like 8.7 for now. And then we want to go up to Image Adjustments, Threshold, and I think I have too high of a blur because I'm not liking how round everything is. Other than that, it's looking good, pretty good. I got to remove some of this texture up here because it's taking a little bit too much away. But we'll leave the threshold about there. We're going to pull some of this Gaussian blur out. It's a little bit too much. And that's much better. So this process, you kind of go back and forth and try and figure out like what you're liking. So that's looking pretty good like that. Looking pretty good. Then we want to go up to Filter, Pixelate, Crystallize, and we want to keep this relatively small, probably like 3 or 4. And that just gave a nice little sort of rugged edge. I'm actually going to drop that down to 3 just to make it a little bit more subtle. And that's much better. Looking good. Now we want to go back into that smart object and I want to remove some of, let me see here. I want to remove some of this right in here because it's a little bit too much. So I'm just going to grab my eraser tool and I'm going to put it on pencil so that there's no transparency. And I'm just going to use a texture brush and kind of remove some of this. And then we'll save it again, Command S. And that looks pretty good. We'll go with that. Looks pretty good. I think we're going to lower this Gaussian blur just a touch more. The more blur that you have, the more rounded the letters will become, which is great for ink bleed, but sometimes it can be a little bit too much. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So next step would be we're going to duplicate this. And we're going to turn that off. And then we want to go into the blend and we want to pull these blacks out. So we want to go about 150. And 100. Next up, we're going to put this into its own group. Call this Plastisol, if I can spell. Plastisol type. And then we want to add a color overlay. and we'll roughly go with that and put our background in again. So as you can see, the color overlay works properly because we made these blend if adjustments here. Otherwise you would have to merge it with the background and then delete the background out. Threshold's just a little funky like that, but in this case it works perfectly fine. So we have that. We're going to rasterize this. Gonna get rid of that copy there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of ink bleed between these letters in certain areas. So what we want to do is add a new layer, and then we're going to grab, what we want to do is make sure that we have the pencil tool selected. So not the brush tool, but the pencil tool, because we don't want transparency, we want rough edges. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to grab a grunge brush, and I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. And we'll just add a little bit of ink bleed between these letters. Looks pretty good. So we're just trying to make it realistic. So obviously when letters bleed together, you're going to get these merging of edges. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here, because we're going to add another effect then, which really will sell the idea of it being plastisol on top. So I think we'll add another one here, and that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Don't think we need to get too crazy with it. Plus we can always add more to it if we don't really like. I do want to affect this S and T here. And that does not look too bad. However, I want to pull a little bit of that out of there. So I'm just on my eraser tool now. That looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So now what we want to do is go into our layer styles again of this group, the plastisol type group, which has the texture and the plastisol layer with the threshold and all that good stuff on it. And then what we want to do, and this is like a little trick that just gives it so much depth, we want to create a new drop shadow, and then we want to make this like a sort of off-white reddish color, something like that. And then we want to have the distance be about 3 pixels. We want the spread on 100, and we want the size on 0. Since we're not really using it as a drop shadow, we're going to use it more as like a highlight, sort of like an edge, like the print on the shirt is lifting up. So we're going to place it about here, maybe, because we want the highlight on the top and also on the, we'll go with like 35. That's pretty good. So if you zoom in, you can see what I'm talking about. It gives it that nice realistic edge, and after we add like the shirt texture and everything else, then it really sells the idea. So after you're done with that, so it's just a drop shadow and the color overlay. We're going to hit OK. Now what I do want to do is clean up this little bit right here off that layer, delete some of that texture out of there. That's just sort of like the extra texture from when we applied the threshold. Get rid of some of that. Anything that we don't purposely want. Okay. Next up, so I'm not fully sure this is the color that we want to go. Let me see. Yeah, it's pretty close. Pretty close. Although I think I'm going to stretch this type just a little bit. In reality, I probably should have stretched the type originally, but I only did it a little bit, so it's not going to affect the resolution much. Plus, we're going with a grungy look. It's not going to hurt it. So next up, we will do, now that we have our ink bleed, we have our print misregister, which is the white highlight. Everything looks real nice. So next up will be, we're going to add the other text, which actually, let me show you. So the original one that I did was this one, which was, I did that with brush and ink. So we'll just use that again. Scale it up a little bit here. And we'll leave it there. So we'll just OK. And then obviously we want to separate the text from the background. So I really just took this with my phone. Nothing fancy. I didn't even use a scanner or anything like that. Very simple. So what we want to do is we want to add a threshold level to this, level adjustment. And you just kind of want to get it, because we want to separate the black and white tones so that I can easily remove it. And we want the edges to be hard. We don't want any softness or anything like that. So that looks pretty good. Then we're going to rasterize the layer. And next we're going to select all the white. We're going to delete it. And then we're going to deselect that. Next, we're going to delete this miscellaneous stuff that we don't want. Let me grab a round brush. Anything that we don't want. And then we're going to grab the lasso. And what we're going to do is kind of just wing this edge a little bit here. Doesn't have to be perfect. Actually, the less perfect it is, the better it is for this sort of approach. Then we're going to delete. That's looking pretty good. We're going to grab this guy over here. We're going to delete it. Very good, very good. And we're gonna, actually before I make it any smaller, I'm gonna make a duplicate, Command J. I'll hide the other one. And I'm gonna put both of these into a group, Command G. We'll call this vintage, and just so I can keep track of what I'm doing here and I don't get confused with the upper layer, I'm gonna recolorize this. So we'll do orange. So the vintage now. Now what we want to do is kind of roughly get the scale. So we're going to scale it down just a little bit. We're going to go into the layer style, and then I'm going to add a pattern overlay, and I'm going to select this sort of halftone paper pattern overlay that I have. So we're going to put that on, but first, actually before I do that, let me go out of that. I want to invert this so that it's white. There we go. Now I'll go in here, add the pattern overlay, and kind of adjust how big I want the halftone here. We'll go about that. Looks pretty good. So now that we have this pattern overlay, now we're going to make a duplicate of that layer again. Turn off the other one. And then we're going to rasterize it. And then we're going to do Command I. Command I to flip the colors. So now we're getting a little bit closer. And we're going to remove some of this. Whoops. A little bit too big. Make sure you don't have caps lock on, or you won't be able to see how big your brush is, which is what just happened to me. And we'll remove any of that excess crap that we don't want. I'm going to come in here, remove some of this. Everything else is looking pretty good. Then we're going to add a threshold to this layer. And then what we're going to do is make sure that contiguous is not checked. And we're going to select the black and delete it out. So that we sort of get this like transparency going on here, as you can see. So that it looks like this is actually ink that's printed on top. Gives a nice effect. So next up we want to add, so we're going to alter this color a little bit. It's a little bit bright, I think. So we're just going to go into the vintage layer styles. We're going to add a color overlay. And we're just going to do a light gray instead of bright white. Something like that. Looks pretty good, I think. and we'll press OK. And while we're adjusting colors, I'm going to go back into the Plastisol folder, go into the color overlay, and I'm going to beef up that red a little bit, make it a little bit more intense, maybe darken it a little bit. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Hit OK. Zoom out, check everything. All right, so now is where the magic starts to happen, and I use my vintage Plastisol brush set, which I created from real Plastisol cracks. Previously, I always did overlaying PNG images, but I decided to make a brush set to really make things a lot easier when you're applying cracked Plastisol effects. It especially works amazingly on text and smaller areas. The idea being that brushes have a more deliberate sort of effect, which means I have different size brushes and things like that. So you can kind of get angles easier. You don't have to overlay a PNG and then mask out areas and things like that. So it's just a lot more deliberate, and it works great in tandem with other texture PNGs. So what we're going to do that is add a new folder. We're just going to call it texture. Color that orange. And then inside that folder, we're going to make a new layer. Plastisol ink cracks. And then in this set, I have a variety of different textures. Just a whole different bunch of looks, different sizes, all sorts of stuff, so that you can really get different effects. And I'm just looking for one that I especially want, and I kind of want something small like this, real tight. So we're just gonna stamp it, and I'm using black right now, and I'm on this new layer in the texture folder. And boom, look at that. One hit with the texture brush and it's already damn good. You can continue to add a couple more things here, but I think that looks pretty good already. So the other nice thing about having it on its own layer is you can also move the cracks, try and place it where you think it looks best. And I think we'll go with right about like that. Looks pretty good. And you can always go in, make a new layer if you want to add more to it. Maybe we'll try adding, that's too big. Some are a little bit bigger, just to add a little bit more cracks. Now the other thing is we can go into, if we don't want to add it on the upper layer as like an overlay layer, we can actually go back into the Plastisol folder here, and on our Plastisol type, which is the red type, we can actually make a layer mask on that, and then we can add plastisol to that. Now the difference between that, so if I add a little bit there, you can see because we have that misregistration effect going on, it'll actually add the white drop shadow wherever we place this. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can always, so we'll add like a tiny one there. We'll do like a little bit on the edge right here. So here it is without what I just added. So you can see I just added that little bit of extra. That looks pretty good. We're going to go back into the plastisol ink cracks on top. Let me try and find another brush to use here. I have a ton of different styles and effects here in these different cracks, different angles. The one thing to remember when you're putting these on, so I created these brushes using threshold layers so that there's no transparency in the brush, no transparent pixels rather. It's all just black and white when I created the brushes. So I would suggest when you put the texture down to use the pencil tool instead of the brush. That way it just kind of, it's all purely hard edged, and it just, you know, looks more like more realistic cracks. You can always make this smaller. Something like that. And when you're using these, you're going to do a lot of like just kind of stamping it and then undoing it, stamping it, undoing it, just trying to see like what looks best. And you don't really know until you try, so you kind of just have to experiment with the texture. And that's a little bit too heavy. So obviously some of them work better for certain things, and that looks pretty good. Perfect. Looking pretty good. And I'm gonna pull some of that texture back out. Let me adjust these ink cracks a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, you could sit here and kind of mess around with it a little bit more, get things a little bit more perfect, but I'm pretty content with how it looks. So having said that, let me close up these folders. And what I'm going to do is put all of these folders, and I'm going to do Command G, group it all together, and then we'll say new design so that I can turn it off and then turn the, so there's the original, and then there's the new one. So you can see not exactly the same, but pretty close. Just to match it a little bit more, I'm gonna adjust this. I think I had it a little bit more, a little bit less orangey and a little bit more. There we go. That's better. Just that tiny little adjustment in color just makes all the difference. There we go. That pretty much wraps it up. I hope that you guys got some enjoyment out of this and you learned something, some new techniques. And also, if you want to pick up my brush set, I will have a link in the description, and it's only $10, so it's totally affordable, and it will definitely speed up your workflow and add some nice realism to your vintage designs. So Thank you guys. I will see you on the next one.